Welcome to the video lecture for Unit 5, Module 10.1.3. In this one, we're going to briefly highlight the pharynx and the esophagus. As always, here are your learning objectives. Be sure to utilize these when studying for your lecture quiz as well as the unit exam. Let's go ahead and get started. The pharynx, or throat, is an anatomical space that serves as a common passageway for solid foods, liquids, and air. We described the epithelial lining and regions of the pharynx, the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx in Module 8. Food normally passes to the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx on its way to the esophagus. These regions have stratified squamous epithelium similar to that of the oral cavity. The lamina propria consists of scattered mucous glands and the lymphatic tissue of the pharyngeal, platal, and linguingual tonsils. Deep to the lamina propria lies a dense layer of elastic fibers bound to the underlying skeletal muscles. The pharyngeal constrictor muscles push past the bolus and towards the esophagus. The palatopharyngeus and the stylopharyngeus muscles elevate the larynx. The palatal muscles elevate the soft palate and adjacent portions of the pharyngeal wall. These muscles work with muscles of the oral cavity and the esophagus to start the swallowing process, which pushes the bolus along the esophagus and into the stomach. The esophagus is a hollow muscular tube that conveys solid food and liquids to the stomach. Its length is approximately 25 centimeters, and its diameter is about 2 centimeters at its widest point. The esophagus begins posterior to the carotid cartilage at the level of vertebra C6. It is narrowest at this point. The esophagus descends towards the thoracic cavity posterior to the trachea, continuing inferiorly along the posterior wall of the mediastinum. It then enters the abdominal pelvic cavity through the esophageal hiatus, an opening in the diaphragm. The esophagus empties into the stomach anterior to vertebra T7. The esophagus is innervated by parasympathetic and sympathetic fibers from the esophageal plexus. Resting muscle tone in the circular muscle layer of the superior 3 centimeters of the esophagus normally prevents air from entering the esophagus. A comparable zone at the inferior end of the esophagus normally remains in a state of active contraction. The state prevents the backflow or reflux of materials from the stomach into the esophagus. Neither region has a well-defined sphincter muscle. Nevertheless, we often use the term upper esophageal sphincter and lower esophageal sphincter, or cardiac sphincter, to describe these regions, which are similar in function to other sphincters. The wall of the esophagus contains mucosal, submucosal, and mucularis layers. Distinctive features of the esophageal wall include the following. The mucus of the esophagus contains a non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium similar to that of the pharynx and oral cavity. The mucosa and submucosa are packed into large folds that extend the length of the esophagus. These folds allow for expansion during the passage of a large bolus. Muscle tone in the walls keeps the lumen closed, except when you swallow. The mucularis mucosae consist of an irregular layer of smooth muscle. The submucosa contains scattered esophageal glands. They produce mucus that reduces friction between the bolus and the esophageal lining. The mucularis externa has the usual inner circular and outer longitudinal layers. However, in the superior third of the esophagus, these layers contain skeletal muscle fibers. The middle third contains a mixture of skeletal and smooth muscle tissue. Along the inferior third, only smooth muscle occurs. There is no serosa, but an adventitia of connective tissue outside the mucularis externa anchors the esophagus to the posterior wall. Over the 1 to 2 centimeters between the diaphragm and the stomach, the esophagus is retroperitoneal. Peritoneum covers the anterior and the left lateral surfaces. Swallowing, or deglutition, is a complex process that can be initiated voluntarily, but proceeds automatically once it begins. You take conscious control over swallowing when you eat or drink, but swallowing is also controlled at the subconscious level. The swallowing reflex begins when the tactile receptors on the palatal arches and the uvula are stimulated by the passage of the bolus. The information is relayed to the swallowing center of the medulla oblongata over the trigeminal nerve and the glossopharyngeal cranial nerves. Motor commands from this center then signal the pharyngeal musculature, producing a coordinated and stereotyped pattern of muscle contraction. It takes less than a second for the pharyngeal muscles to propel the bolus in the esophagus. During this period, the respiratory centers are inhibited and breathing stops. Swallowing takes place at regular intervals as saliva collects at the back of the mouth. Each day you swallow approximately 2,400 times. We can divide swallowing into buccal, pharyngeal, and esophageal phases. Primary peristaltic waves are peristaltic movements coordinated by afferent and efferent fibers in the glossopharyngeal and the vagus nerves. For a typical bolus, the entire triple on the esophagus takes about 9 seconds. Liquids may take the journey in a few seconds, flowing ahead of the peristaltic contractions with the assistance of gravity. A dry or polylubricated bolus travels much more slowly. A series of secondary peristaltic waves may be required to push it all the way to the stomach. Secondary peristaltic waves are local reflexes triggered by the stimulation of sensory receptors in the esophageal walls.